Don't ask me what I feel about myself. Ask me what I know about God. Ask me what I know about His Word.
I just realized something. He wasn't sleeping on a pillow. He was sleeping on purpose.
Something to say I think is important but not essential would be like the inerrancy of Scripture.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And I hold to the inerrancy of Scripture.
Okay.
Title of my sermon tonight is Why Church Nurseries Are Unscriptural and Wrong. And so that's why I have a baby on my hip right here.
There is a level of anointing that I believe is going to invade your homes, invade your sight, invade your senses. That's going to, I literally feel that chains are going to break off of you.
Do you think I'm wrong? Yeah. Yay! So am I a bad guy for saying you're wrong? Yeah. I am? Yeah. That's not fair.
Hey, by the way, you are a slave. If you're not a slave of Christ, you're a slave of sin. You aren't free. Choose your master.
Give us some men who know the truth.
So, Stephen, my friend, you wrote a book. How does that feel?
It was, it took a while and it was a process, and I learned a lot through the process, but I'm glad it's done.
Yeah. Okay. Well,
Yeah.
I was surprised at how big the book is. I don't have it with me. It's by my side of the bed at home. I didn't expect it to be as thick as it was. You didn't just write a book. You wrote a big book, Stephen.
Right. 400 pages. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, I don't read much myself. So it's like a book that I would never pick because it's too long. But I did put lots of pictures in it.
Yes. Yeah. And pictures are great. Those are really helpful to help see what's being described. I really enjoyed that aspect of the book too. And it is funny. I mean, you talk about being dyslexic in the book, not reading your first book until after you graduated college. You talk about how you're not a natural speaker and how that was really what freaked you out about a lot of things in missions was having to speak. And it's like, here you are today doing an extended interview about a 400-page book you've written. Did you ever think you would end up here?
No, no. It's probably the last thing I thought I'd ever do is write a book. It's still hard for me to pass it out to friends without being embarrassed, that I've written a book.
Embarrassed? Yes. What do you mean?
It's the last thing I think anybody would have expected from me. So.
Well, I'm glad you did it. And I'm sure, you're glad that you did it in your heart of hearts. You're glad that you did it and you want people to read it because it's not a story that your life story. It's not a story that exalts yourself. It's exalting the God who has brought you through so many interesting things. And I would like to spend some time kind of exploring your pre-conversion life, because the vast majority of the book is post-conversion and missions in your life in Eastern Europe and Russia, and doing wrestling as a way to get into those countries and to do Christian missionary work. But I'm curious about some things about your upbringing. For instance, one of the things that you mentioned in the book was that you were raised in a Christian context. So you want to give some more background as to what that looked like?
Yeah, we went to it was a conservative congregational church in St. Louis till I was probably 6 years old. And then we moved to Ohio. And after that, we were always in a Baptist church of some kind, always conservative. I heard Bible stories and about Jesus in Sunday school growing up. My mom read Bible stories to us every evening before we went to bed. Heard a lot of sermons over the years. And really, there wasn't a time in my life where I didn't love God, where I didn't believe in God. I always believed in God. And, when I was a little kid, probably 6 years old, I prayed to receive Christ. I wanted him in my life. But there's a lot that I didn't understand.
Yeah.
And through life experiences, I began to understand some things and come to some conclusions. And that's when I decided to commit my life to God and really live for him, put him first in my life. But it was a process. Yeah.
What about your siblings? I remember in the book you talk about, I think, brothers, but how many brothers versus sisters, and where?
2 brothers and 1 sister.
Okay. And where did they end up spiritually?
They're all believers. My mom and dad, they were so faithful to instructing us the way that we should go, and I think it's been a process for most of us, but yeah, I think we're doing good now.
Amen. Well, that proverb rings true, right? Bring up a child in the way he should go, and when he's old, he will not depart from it.
Yeah.
That's amazing. God's faithfulness there. And so you were raised in a Christian context, and you were also raised in, at least off and on, if not continually, in a farming context, which is where you are now too. You've kind of come full circle in some ways, I guess. Farming has also been a big part of your life, huh?
Yeah. When we lived in Massachusetts, we had a 50-acre farm. It was the original acreage for this house that was built in 1790. We owned the land, and the border of our land was a stone wall that had been built about the same time as the house. And I loved that farm there. I was in the 4-H sheep club. I raised sheep, but I always wanted cows. But anyway, in our area, almost nobody had cows. So I showed my sheep in the local Grange fairs. And then we had to move to Los Angeles when I was 14, about halfway through my freshman year. And California, well, Los Angeles was a long way from the farm.
Oh man, Massachusetts to Southern California. It's like how much farther apart can you get?
Boy, and really culturally, you couldn't have gotten any further apart. We had to wear slacks and button-up shirts in Massachusetts. Everything was pretty formal. When I got to California, jeans, T-shirts, and Led Zeppelin playing in the cafeteria. I didn't even know what that was.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, so very different, long way from the farm.
But there's this farm in Missouri where you live now that has been in your family, a lot of acreage there, and you've embraced the farm. This is your life now.
Oh, well, yeah, it's part of my life.
Okay.
My neighbor, he took over in 1991 when we left for Russia, and he's still farming my farm. So,
okay.
Yeah, I do a few things around, and we've got some cows that we take care of.
You're a farmer supervisor, maybe. That's a good way to put it, huh?
I wish I could say that. No, my farmer, he knows what to do without any supervision. If I supervised, I'd mess things up.
Okay. Well, yeah, it's amazing. And to think you moved too from Massachusetts to Los Angeles back when it had to be a horse and carriage. I mean, that had to take a long time.
It wasn't quite that long ago.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, let's get into wrestling then. So, because wrestling obviously is a major part of this story. You went from wrangling sheep on the farm in Massachusetts to eventually you are hitting the mat, you're wrestling, and it turns into something that you enjoy and that apparently you have a skill at. So you want to give, I know in the book you go into detail, but just give a flyover about how you got into wrestling when you were in school.
Right. In Massachusetts, I mean, I love sport, so I had to do something. And so I went out for basketball. So when we moved to California, I told my basketball coach, I'm sorry, I'm leaving the team. I'm moving to California. He looks up from his clipboard, and I don't think he even recognized me. I definitely wasn't one of the better players on the team. And he said, "Oh, okay, see ya." So anyway, at my new school, very first day, I found out they had a wrestling team, and somehow I always felt like I was a wrestler. So I went out for wrestling my first day in the new school. And I loved it right from the start. My coach told me later, he just heard a lot of noise and people getting thrown around. No points being scored because I didn't know what that meant yet. But so anyway, 2 weeks later, varsity guy gets sick, JV guy hurts his shoulder, and I've got to wrestle for the team. My first match was against the league champion. So I'm walking out on the mat and my coach gives me instructions. He says, don't get pinned. I followed his instructions for 52 seconds.
52.
And that's when I got pinned. But right from the start, I loved it. And it became this real big part of my life. And I got better pretty fast as I had more practice,
Well, yeah, you got really good. You eventually, excelled to the point of being able to wrestle at a Division I school and make your way to the top there. But that also is what God used to really break you, huh?
Yes. Yeah. A teammate of mine and I, we won the California State Tournament in 1973, California's first state tournament ever. They put all 10 sections of California together in one big state tournament. I actually went with my teammate, John Jackson, to the 50th anniversary of the California State Tournament. They had a special ceremony where they wanted all the original state champions to march. And so we went for that. And we were recruited to several different schools, but we chose Oklahoma State because Oklahoma State had, they had won by 1973, they had won 27 national team titles in wrestling, and they had 90 national champions. So we didn't know that. We realized that when we were there on a recruiting trip. And so we said, yeah, this is where we want to go, because my goal was now to become national champ. I worked really hard. I got a little better each year. And finally, when I was a senior, I won the tournament. I thought that was going to make me happy the rest of my life. I thought it was going to completely fulfill me. But by the next morning, that feeling of happiness was already gone. So I realized that there were things, or actually God helped me realize that there were things in life that are more important than achievement in sport. I had made wrestling basically my idol. That was number one in my life. And after realizing some things, I wanted to put God first in my life, and I wanted to continue wrestling, but I wanted to wrestle now for His glory rather than wrestling for my own glory.
Was the wrestling a full ride situation for you? Did you get college paid for because of that?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
That was back when college was really expensive. It was $2,500 a year for out-of-state tuition, and that included, of course, room and board.
Oh man, yeah. How did anyone ever pay for that? Wow.
Yeah.
What did mom and dad think when you really started to go headlong into wrestling in high school, and then this was what you were going to do through college? How did they feel about that?
My dad, he wasn't an athlete, but he had two older brothers that were like football stars. His dad, my grandfather, played in our family came from St. Louis. He played in the St. Louis Olympics basketball back in 1904. Now his team didn't win. There was a team from Buffalo that won. Only American teams were in this thing. So, because it was an introductory sport. But anyway, he was an athlete, also a star basketball player. So my dad, he had an appreciation for sport, and his older brothers were like his heroes. So even though he was like a rocket scientist, literally, he worked on all the Apollo projects, engineering different parts. He did have an appreciation for sport, and I think he was proud of my achievements.
Okay, so that wasn't a source of tension then with your parents, that you were wrestling guy. They didn't have any kind of I don't know, bias against wrestling.
No.
Yeah. Well, as you were going through, high school and eventually making your way to being a champion in high school, and you were going through college there at Oklahoma State and making your way to being a NCAA champion at Oklahoma State, how did this idolatry aspect with sports build? Was it like after you have some success, you look at yourself in the mirror and flex a little bit and think, "Hey, I look pretty good," kind of thing, or what was really at the heart, I guess, of that idolatry? Was it was it self? Was it having a platform that you'd be in front of others, that they would look up to you? What was it?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think the root of it was my motivation for wrestling. And definitely I was wrestling to glorify myself, so that people would look up to me, or think that I was important or something. And wrestling became my identity. And it actually, I think in the end, it was a detriment to my wrestling. In my junior year, I was undefeated at Oklahoma State all year long, ranked first all year long, seeded first in the national tournament. And I managed to lose to a guy who wasn't even seeded. He'd only won probably 50% of his matches that year. I was so afraid of losing that what had made me good was this really aggressive style. I just went after guys. I wasn't afraid to do anything. I lost some points every now and then, but I would always get them back. It was a pretty crazy style of wrestling. And in those matches, I wrestled really conservative. So what had made me good, I completely abandoned that style because of this fear of losing. Kyle Schneider is a famous wrestler now for America. He's still competing. He won the World Championships when he was 19. He won the Olympics when he was 20 at an upper weight. Anyway, he said, and I hope I'm not misquoting him, he said something like, if you want to win more than anything else, the thing you're going to fear most is losing. And he said he got really nervous before matches. He completely changed his philosophy of wrestling to just going out there and doing the best he can and doing it for God's glory. And he said it made all the difference. And really, I wish I would have understood that earlier in my wrestling career. I wish I would have used wrestling as a platform. I had plenty of chances to speak, to talk to folks about my faith, but instead I just talked about wrestling. I wish I would have used wrestling as a platform to share my faith with other people, to positively influence people toward God, rather than self-glorification.
Well, especially, I imagine your junior year, that match that you lost in the tournament to the guy who wasn't even seeded. You were number one seed. He was unranked. And that's the end of your season, I imagine, right? Losing in the tournament, that was the end.
This guy did make it to the finals.
Okay.
So I wrestled in the consolation bracket, and literally I wrestled the best matches of my life. I didn't care about winning or losing anymore. I just wanted to wrestle. One of my first matches was against a defending national champ who had lost to the eventual champ by, I think it was a point in overtime. I was beating him 10-0 when I pinned him less than a minute into the match. The guy I wrestled for third and fourth was a good wrestler. I scored 20 points on him in this match. So yeah, I I wrestled some of the best match, but it was using my style, the go after him style.
Yeah, the fear was gone because you already lost that initial match, and so it's like, well, I got nothing left to lose. I'm just going to do what I want to do.
I'm just going to wrestle. Yeah, it's true.
Yeah, well, I imagine that had to be humiliating when you were in that mindset of self-glorification and you lose in that opening round. That had to be just a humbling, a real, truly humbling moment for a 21-year-old or however old you were at the time. Which, looking back, obviously, it could have been a great time for you to share how, well, wrestling isn't my ultimate, that Jesus is my ultimate, but your heart just wasn't there yet.
Right.
And it's amazing that God used your winning to bring you to that point. Because you would think like, okay, well, that would be the moment when a guy loses a very important match, he'll hit rock bottom. but it actually took success for you to be broken, which is kind of like a paradox, I guess.
It is. I've always kind of likened it to Solomon when he writes in Ecclesiastes. He lists all of his accomplishments. He lists all the things that he has. He's the richest guy on earth, the most powerful guy on earth. He has everything. He's got a harem of 1,000 supermodels from the ancient world. And sprinkled throughout all of this is the phrase, striving after the wind, and vanity, vanity, all is vanity. And it took, and I didn't come up to that conclusion like Solomon, but I did come up to the same conclusion through wrestling, and really in that one event, it taught me the exact same principle. Anything apart from God, if you have your hope of satisfaction in anything other than God, you're going to ultimately be disappointed, because He created us to know Him, and that should be the most important thing in our life.
Well, yeah, let's jump to that next year where you do have success. As you were viewing it at that point, your senior year, you become the champion, the NCAA champion in your class for wrestling. Going into that championship match, were you nervous? I mean, what do you remember about that time? Was it a mismatch in any way, or what was running through your mind leading up to that final match?
It was exactly the same as the previous year. I got out to a lead, right away, and then I started putting on the brakes, and I just kept backing up and backing up. I got stall warnings. This never happened to me in wrestling. Stalling, that wasn't part of my repertoire.
Because you're an aggressive guy. You're not a tiptoe guy.
I got almost as many stall warnings and stall points against me as you can get before you get thrown out of the match. So I think with like a minute left, we're on our feet. It's tied, and I'm still stalling. And I get another stalling point against me. Now he's ahead. I got 1 minute left in my college career. And it was like a light bulb went on, it's time to wrestle. And so anyway, I went after him and ended up picking up 8 points in the last minute and beating him 12-5.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's amazing. And I imagine they do the podium thing where it's like, okay, you're first place. They obviously hold up your arm to signal that you won the match, but then at the end, they've got maybe top 3 or whatever. You got first place. What were you feeling in that moment? What do you remember about that?
I say I was happy until the next morning. I don't even remember being happy up there on the podium. I just remember being relieved that I finally won and it's all over, So I've got a few pictures of me up on the podium, and I don't think any of them's I've got a smile on my face. It's just this huge sense of relief.
And at that point, I guess you probably thought your wrestling days were just totally done, because there you were your senior year. It was the championship to end the year, or the tournament to end the year, and you were done. I mean, I guess maybe you had your eye on the Olympics. That would have been what the 1980 Olympics that were coming up. Were you thinking about that at all?
Yeah, I wanted to continue wrestling.
Oh, okay.
And so I did continue, but I continued with completely different motives.
Hmm.
You know, and a lot of people think, well, if you make a real commitment to Jesus, you're going to be soft or weak or too compassionate. It's different than that. I actually worked out harder. I had a much higher reason for wrestling than when I was wrestling for myself.
Well, explain how you got there, because you're talking about next morning. The next morning was a real sense of emptiness. So take us to that next morning after the championship match, and how God got you to the place of where you're still wrestling, but with a new view, and you're actually working harder. How did that evolution happen?
Yeah, I did give you the short version. There was actually, there were more things that actually led me to that, conclusion. Sure. And that made me ready to join Athletes in Action, which is basically a group of wrestling missionaries. The next year at Oklahoma State, I had already graduated. I was working as an assistant coach, graduate assistant, sorry. We had a new recruit that year, Dave Schultz. Dave Schultz, when he was still in high school, wrestled in an open tournament, beat the defending national champion. He was a two-time national champ, most outstanding wrestler. Dave beat him when he was still in high school. So,
wow, he's the real deal.
Everybody wanted Dave Schultz. Dave decided to go to Oklahoma State. And from the first day, September 1st, wrestling practice, I'm wrestling with Dave. Dave had this incredible ability to pick up moves. He'd stop me and say, "Hey, what'd you do there? How'd you do that on me?" And I'd show him the move, and he goes, "Well, how would you stop that?" I showed him how to stop it. So anyway, we wrestled for like 2 months. And in November, there's the orange and black match. Orange and black are Oklahoma State's school colors. Coach divides the best 2 wrestlers in each weight class up into 2 teams. They wrestle each other, and the guy that wins, he, at least at the beginning of the season, is going to be the varsity guy. So Dave had no worthy challengers in the room. So coach wanted me to wrestle Dave. I wasn't real excited about that because Dave was 2 weight classes above me. And I had shown him everything that everything in my bag of tricks, I had already showed him how to defend it. So, but coach wanted me to wrestle because he knew that would draw a lot bigger crowd. And we'd make a lot more money on that if that was the featured match, defending national champs, favorite wrestler against this recruit that is probably the most highly recruited wrestler ever out of high school. So we wrestled that night. When I got introduced and went out on the mat, I got this standing ovation that I always got when I went out on the mat. And we shook hands, we started wrestling. Dave gets the first takedown, and already, there's people in the crowd clapping for Dave, And then as the match goes on, Dave picks up a couple more points, picking up momentum, this people yelling for Dave. And by the second period, the crowd is solidly now behind Dave. And I'm trying so hard to win. At one point in the third period, I get a hold of his leg I'm pulling so hard to take him down that I break my own rib. And I don't stop the match. It's the referee that stops the match because he sees I'm hurt. Now there are people in the crowd that are actually booing. Hey, ref, he's faking it. Make him get up and wrestle. So anyway, I finished the match. Dave wins, and I think it was 7-2. And I had never heard that much noise in Gallagher Hall. The crowd just goes nuts. My coach that I wrestled for 4 years comes out on the mat, picks Dave up on his shoulder, and he's carrying Dave around as the crowd goes crazy.
Solomon has slain his thousands and David his tens of thousands.
Exactly. So obviously, the crowd had a new hero, somebody that was going to probably be a 4-time national champ, which had never been done before. So anyway, after that evening, I realized, obviously, that the crowd didn't love me. They loved the way I wrestled. They loved to be the fan of a champion. They love it when I make points for the team. But me personally, I was exchanged for another hero pretty quickly.
Yeah, you were tossed aside like an old pair of shoes.
Like an old pair of shoes. And I remember two things. I was tired of wrestling for my own glory because my accomplishment didn't bring me what I thought they would. And I was tired of wrestling for the crowd. I was tired of wrestling for the fans because although even now I look back, there's no place I would have rather wrestled than Oklahoma State. I realized their limitations, that they really didn't love me. And it was right after that a couple guys from Athletes in Action came. They were in Stillwater. They came to our apartment and challenged me to join Athletes in Action. And God used those two events in my life to really, it's like lift the curtain, open my eyes to seeing what life is really all about, and what the most important things in life really are.
And that entered you into a world of giving your life for the gospel to reach people in hard to reach places, and a lifetime of stories that you've accumulated now through the decades of going into some really difficult places. And I thought it was interesting because I've obviously known you now for, 15 years, a little more. And I hadn't really ever heard much about those first years as a missionary when you went to Vienna or that area there. And I love seeing that original prayer card that you had in there in the book that you guys had when you first became missionaries, and probably were thinking at times, what on earth did we get ourselves into? But hearing those stories of going over to Eastern Europe, I hadn't really heard too much about those days. And so what an interesting thing you got your family into. From the beginning, difficulty, danger, but also so much grace and so much power of God too.
Right. Yeah. We could feel God's hand on us a lot of times. And I love those years. I am so thankful for the opportunity we had to go to those places, wrestle in the tournaments, talk to people about the Lord. And God used that time to mature me, give me some confidence in what He had given me for His glory, Yeah,
what was ministry like then at the beginning, whenever you were there in Austria to now, where you're going to Mongolia and Russia and Ukraine and things like that? Well, I mean, what was ministry like then, and what is it like now as far as how you got in and how you were able to communicate the gospel? Has it basically been the same, or has there been development there?
That's a good question. One of the things that we did well, we we were used by other churches and other organizations that had a permanent ministry in different regions. We would come in and do an evangelistic wrestling demonstration, which was a lot of fun to watch. It included professional wrestling. I was Cowboy Steve, and Carl Dampman was the heavyweight, and he was Der Vernichter, the destroyer, and he'd wear a black hose over his face and all black.
Oh,
and,
so like your own versions of Jake the Snake Plumber and Hacksaw Jim Duggan and those guys, huh?
Right. And we included the crowd even in this thing. I'd get tossed into the crowd at one point, and I'd come rolling into the crowd, and I'd pull somebody's shoe off and just breathe deep breaths, bring it in for strength, and then come back and beat the destroyer. But we used that, and it was a lot of fun. It was interesting. We showed real wrestling, but then we would share our faith, and just in that atmosphere of kind of fun and friendship, people responded to that. So I learned a lot from that. I learned a lot from doing Athletes in Action wrestling camps about how to intensively work with young athletes in a camp context, and slowly unveil the gospel during the week in our evening programs, and then really give them a good idea of how a person can come to know the Lord. So anyway, I learned so much through all of that, and God slowly began to open my mouth. I originally joined Athletes in Action when Larry Amundsen and Gene Davis, the coach, came to our apartment in Stillwater and challenged us to join Athletes in Action. I said, I'll join, but I don't do any talking. So they said, that's okay, Steve. We got a whole team, and the guys that are good at speaking, they'll speak, but sooner or later, we're going to help you through all that. So I literally joined a team of missionaries under the condition I wouldn't have to speak. But God slowly helped to open my mouth, and now it's hard to keep me quiet.
You went from being the mute missionary to an actual missionary. That's good.
There you go.
Yeah, well, let's talk about some of the opposition. What was some of the first opposition you experienced in doing overseas mission from governments? I've read certainly not all the book, but I've read enough of the book to hear about what you were facing there in Eastern Europe, which almost sounds like a different world. I mean, it's hard to imagine what you were going through, but can you describe what that opposition was like?
I don't think I was ever nervous for myself. But in Eastern Europe at that time, we would be followed, depending on the country, we would be followed by, KGB guys. So we were more nervous about meeting with believers, getting them in trouble.
So how did they know to follow you? How were they able to access information? What kind of information did they access to know that you were someone they should follow, I guess?
You had to register everywhere you went. You had to register. So, and if you didn't register, you got in trouble. So there were lots of rules. It wasn't hard to figure out who we were, that we were foreigners. So, anyway, that wasn't a hard job.
And so just by virtue of being a foreigner, being American, and having an American accent, an American name, and all that stuff, you were worthy of being followed just for that reason, probably back then, huh?
Oh yeah. I remember we drove to the Soviet Union in 1983, and where we were supposed to go to a hotel. It was called hotel camping. It was actually, like permanent tents that, you could stay in. That was the cheapest place. And so that's what I chose. You had to have your itinerary chosen before you ever went there. It was part of the visa process. So according to my visa and our itinerary, we go to this place in Kiev, and we're driving around and we can't find it. And this car is following us. Now, you ask, how do they know how to follow us? Well, part of it was the car we were driving. It wasn't Soviet, you know. So anyway, immediately somebody's following us, and we can't find where we're going. So I stopped the car and I flagged the guy, you know, to come alongside, and he stops too. He comes alongside, and a buddy of mine who spoke Polish, and this guy understood. He said, can you tell us where camping is? The guy goes, I don't know where it is. He says, we know you're following us. You're going to go there anyway. Why don't you just lead us? And he goes, oh, okay. You know, that made sense. So the KGB guy leads us there. But yeah, we were followed. One time and we didn't get in trouble very often, but one time in Czechoslovakia, we smuggled in a bunch of Bibles. We knew the Russian team was going to be there, or I should say the Soviet team. And we knew the Czech national team was going to be at this training camp. So we brought Bibles in both Czech and Russian. And it was probably New Testaments. And back then, for guys trying to get stuff in, they made it really small print on almost like newspaper. But anyway, they were really small and compact, and we brought a bunch of them. So we were giving them out to the wrestlers, both Soviet and Czech wrestlers. The coach pulls us in and says, hey, you guys can't do that. You know, you've been passing out Bibles, and for political reasons, we're really glad you're here, but for political reasons, you know, you can't continue that. So we said, okay, we won't. And the assistant coach follows us out and goes, I didn't know you guys had Bibles. Give me one. And we had to tell him, we really were out of them. We don't have any more.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, I imagine just at every turn, there was possibility of people just hearing about what you're doing and trying to shut it down. You said national team. So like at an event like that, going back to whatever year that was, you said Czech national team, Russian national team. These are like college age guys. They're like, I guess what we would view as like their college national team, or are they older than that? Who are those people, I guess? You know,
junior level wrestling goes up to 20 years old. So senior level is after that, anything after that. And so we would go to their senior national training camps. There'd be any people anywhere from 20 to, you know, I mean, they wrestled sometimes up to 30 because it was their job.
Okay. And so you would be able to, as a member of Athletes in Action and whatever kind of relationship they developed in these countries, you were able to go to those training camps as, what were you doing? Like teaching or competing with them, or training, or what did that look like?
Right. In all, in my overseas wrestling career, I wrestled in 15 different international tournaments. So in all but 2 of those, I was in the finals, and I won 8 of them. So it was me, and then we had another active wrestler, Don Schuler, who was always at the top also. He was always on the podium. So they were glad to have us come and work out with their guys. But even bigger than that, we had John Peterson with us, who was an Olympic champion wrestler, still relatively young. And he was working out also. And yes, he would show some stuff. So at tournaments, we would get invitations all the time to come and wrestle with their national team in various training camps. So anyway, we had a lot of open doors. And in the context of sport, it was so much easier to openly, talk to wrestlers about the Bible. There there were national teams that actually met with us in Bible studies with the approval of their coach during that time frame.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. So you're these wrestlers with international clout then, and God was just opening doors where you were able to do Bible studies. That's amazing. And I don't want to get too sidetracked from the missionary aspect of all this, where I want to spend a lot of our time here, but this is, of course, we're kind of like hovering around that 1980 and 1984 Olympics. But the 1980 Olympics those were taking place in Russia, right? That's why we as America didn't participate.
Right. We boycotted the Moscow Olympics because of the war in Afghanistan.
And that would have been your gold medal. You missed it.
Well, I would have liked to have won. Yes.
So what was going through your mind at that time then? Because I mean, obviously, if you wanted to keep wrestling after college, the Olympics right there on the horizon, it was like just sitting there for the taking. And I know this is your view of wrestling had changed, but that had to hurt still, huh?
Yeah. I did try out for the Olympics. There's Olympic trial tournament. I actually won the tournament. Somewhere between the tournament and the final camp, where the final selection is made, who's going to represent the U.S. The boycott was already in effect. I mean, there was no way we were going to go. So I didn't actually go to the final trials. I ended up going to helping with Athletes in Action summer camps. But a year and a half before the Olympics, I wrestled the guy who ended up winning the Olympics for the Soviet Union. He wrestled the Bulgarian in the finals, and he beat the Bulgarian, I think, 6-0. So he was pretty dominant. His name was Saipullah Absaidov.
Oh, yes. A household name.
Yes, as you know. So anyway, we had a pretty good match in the Soviet Union. It was in Georgia, Tbilisi, Georgia. The final score was 12-13. He was ahead by a point. I was holding him on his back. If I held him on his back for 5 seconds, I would get an additional point. The score would have been 13-13, and I would have won on what was called criteria. So I'm holding him on his back, and the ref is counting. And remember, the guy with the clock, it's not a digital readout, where everybody can see it. It's in the Soviet guy's hand. He's got a stopwatch in his hand. The referee's counting 1, 2, 3, 4, and the guy with the watch, the clock, hits the gong, which means the end of the period. So I suspect, because this happened all the time, our match was cut a little bit short for strategic reasons.
The Soviets wouldn't do something like that, would they?
They cheated. I got cheated so bad in the same tournament to get to that place where I wrestled him. This guy in his back, and he was flat for so long, and you have to have 2 of the 3 refs have to call it a pin, signal, they raise their hand, signaling a pin. And one guy would raise his hand, put it down. Another guy would raise his hand, but never 2 in a row. And accidentally, 2 guys put their hand up at the same time. So they blow the whistle. The 3 of them get together, and they decide to start the match again. And the head of FILA, the governing body over wrestling, Milan Ersigin, he sees this from the head referee table. And he literally leaves that table and comes running to my mat. And these guys see him coming. They quick raise my hand and literally shove me off the mat.
Wow.
But yeah, we got cheated all the time.
There were some shenanigans going on. Yeah, they talk about self-glorification. They were not comfortable with losing, I guess, huh?
That's right.
You mentioned the KGB, and have no idea how much this is has to be sensitive or private, or how much you can talk about it or not talk about it. No idea. So I'm just going to throw it out there, and you just answer however you like. What's your relationship with the KGB like been over the years as you've been in and out of Russia and seeking to influence Russians with the gospel?
That's a good question. Very minimal, I would say. During our years in Moscow, it was when we moved down to the Caucasus Mountain region. They're politically, it's like they're walking a tightrope, because Russians are ethnically Orthodox Christians, and down in the Caucasus where we were, most of the people groups are Muslims. So there's always this fine line. You got to placate the Muslims so that they don't become radicalized. You don't want to give them a reason to become radical. So we did have problems with the KGB down there, especially after there was a war in the republic that we were living in. The war was in 06, and by 07, I was deported after several run-ins with the KGB during that time frame. So they'd always been watching us, tracking our movements, not just physical movements, but what we were up to in the Republic. But after that war, there was very destabilizing. They really wanted to get rid of anybody that would cause Muslims to want to become more radical.
What did deportation look like? Was that a traumatizing event, or was it just basically paperwork?
I was coming back with another guy on our team, Ben Sprunger. We were coming back from a wrestling camp in Southern Ossetia. So anyway, we used to be able to cross the Caucasus and come and drive, but because of tensions, Westerners were not allowed to go that way anymore. So we had to drive to Tbilisi, Georgia, and then fly from there into the republic that we live in. Probably nobody's ever heard of it, so I haven't used the name. It's called the Republic of Kabardino-Balkaria.
Ah.
It's right next to Karacháyevo-Cherkessia.
Oh, well, okay, now I get it.
Now you know the proximity, yes. So when we came back into my home airport, Nalchik is the name of our city, that's when I was detained for 3 days. So it's a small airport. There's only a handful of international flights, and they're not every day. So I was put in a room, and on the third day, then I was escorted onto a plane, and it's just going to a random location. It was going to Antalya, Turkey, and so they put me on the plane, and that was it. Yeah. In the end, I was actually glad it took 3 days, because, at first I had people high up. One guy that called me even had access to Putin. He was on Putin's he was like the minister of physical education, which was an appointment by the president. So anyway, they called me up and they said, "Steve, we're sorry about what's going on. This is a mistake, and I'm going to fix it." So then they started calling. There were 3 different guys that were highly placed, making phone calls on my behalf. And each one of them got a call from our friends, the KGB, and said, if you bring up this anymore about Stephen Barrett, then you're going to lose your job. So each one of them, I said, yes, stop. And that's when it became apparent to me that, wow, it's true. I really am going to get deported. And then the KGB guys, they're part of one of the most evil institutions ever. Think about killing so many of your own people, upwards of 20 million of your own people through their operations, torturing Christians in prisons and killing them too. So I don't know what it was, but I started praying for these guys, because I thought, these guys are so far from God. And, they need Jesus. So anyway, and I wouldn't normally do that. I'm not that good a guy, trust me. But, when you're in certain situations, I think God gives you the grace to handle it in a way that would be pleasing to him, and the Bible does say to pray for those who persecute you. And not even thinking about that verse, later I thought about, oh, wow, that's what the Bible says to do. God gives you the strength to do it. So anyway, that's my association with the KGB.
So when you say you were detained for 3 days, does that mean you were actually in a jail? I mean, I'm assuming that's what that means.
I was detained at the airport.
Okay.
So I was in a room guarded. And so my wife, Cindy, she had contacts there in the airport, and they asked, the KGB if she could come in, and they gave her permission. And at one point she gave me one of those real thin mattresses because I was sleeping on the floor, and brought me some pizza.
Okay. Yeah. I was going to ask about food. Like, was the KGB getting you crackers and water or something, or how'd that work?
I think I ate twice. Once was the pizza, and once I'm pretty sure somebody from the airport brought me some food.
Did you have any interaction with the guards? You're a fluent Russian speaker. Were you getting in a deep conversation with them?
Not really. No, they're always kind of, each time, there were several times where I was stopped by the KGB and then brought in, but they don't do it themselves. They have, for example, the immigration service. So I would have, all my interaction would be with the immigration service. Well, they don't want to detain me. They're being forced to do it by these people almost literally behind the curtain. So I had to go, I've had to go 3 times to court, to defend myself under basically trumped up charges.
Did you ever feel like, I don't know, discouraged down deep in your soul that this was happening to you? Like, this isn't the way it's supposed to be, and there's so much invasion of privacy going on, and just it runs against all of our sentiments and values as Americans who believe in independence. We believe in true freedom of expression and freedom of religion. Did that ever become a hang up for you?
Yeah, like my rights are being violated.
Yeah, right.
No. I knew where I was. I knew what I was well aware of the potential problems that would arise. It was when I went to Mongolia. Before I went to Mongolia, a fellow missionary that I knew who had been there for several years and had left, he wrote me the longest email I'd ever gotten. And his message was basically, hey, these guys are going to sidle up alongside you, act like they're interested, but really all they want is something from you. They want to use you. So I wrote him an email back, and it was pretty short. And it was basically, I've lived in Russia for 16 years. I am well aware that that is a possibility. But I told him, I gave him the example of Jesus and the 10 lepers. where only Jesus heals 10 lepers. And I don't know what it would be like to have leprosy, but it'd be a hideous thing to have, to watch your skin, rot off and extremities drop off. It'd just be an awful thing to have. So I don't know how happy I'd be if Jesus healed me from that. Mm-hmm. But interestingly enough, only one of the 10 come back to thank Jesus. And I said, if I do 10 kind things and I only get thanked or appreciated once, that's the same odds Jesus got, So we can expect that. And I always expected that up front, and especially from the government. So no, it didn't discourage me. Now, being deported from Russia did, because I had no idea that was coming. All the signs were there. They had even broken into our apartment and got into our computer while we were going to church, the KGB. So the signs were there. They were looking for a reason to deport us. But still, it came as this big shock to me. And yeah, it was sad having to leave, the place. I loved being there. I loved my work there. I really felt being used. I was being used by God there. So it was hard to leave. Yeah.
Well, why didn't that break your spirit when they would do something like break into your home and look at your computer or anything else? I mean, because we know that warfare generally happens at multiple levels. I mean, the physical side of things, physically deporting you or physically harming you or detaining you or whatever, that's only one aspect of it. There's also mind games that are played in all of that. Why would you say that didn't break your spirit as perhaps they wanted it to?
I don't know. Listen, there were things that did discourage me over there. And there were times where what kept me there was my call. I knew God had called me there, and I didn't feel like he was calling me home, to America. So what kept me there was the assurance I had that this was where God wanted me. And I knew it was going to be rough. And I like to think that, wrestlers are good at persevering. You're down, but you keep going. You don't stop. You don't let that discourage you. You get taken down, you get up, and you get those points back. That was part of, I'm sure God used that in my life, wrestling, to develop perseverance.
Yeah, you're an aggressive guy, right? You don't tiptoe, you're aggressive.
That's right. You don't knock, you just knock the door down.
Yeah, right. I'm curious too. This is definitely a side thing, but just if you had any thoughts on the direction that we're going in our country and experiencing more and more of invasions of privacy and more hindrances on what we can say and when we can say it and where we can say it, and being policed by our neighbors about the things we say and do, and if it's kosher with what the powers that be want to happen. Having lived through that in an extreme way in Russia and other places where that is more of the norm, do you have any thoughts on what we're experiencing today in America and where this could be all headed?
Yeah, I have no doubt where the direction we're going leads. It's unquestionable. It leads to a totalitarian regime where we lose all of our rights, literally. And we're running to embrace that. We are so unaware of the signs. I mean, if you've lived in a culture like that, I mean, it's just like there's billboards up there, and people are missing it. Pointing toward totalitarianism. Yeah. I lament the decisions we're making as a country, for sure. And, even my daughters who are, basically raised in Russia, they're very politically active. And they also have that hypersensitivity. They know where, you make this decision, they know where it leads because they've seen it before.
And you're not one to say, "Oh, I've lived it. It's not so bad." You have lived it. You know it's bad. So,
it's a nightmare.
So even though it can't stop the gospel, it can still, of course, be a hindrance that we want to avoid, I guess, right? I mean, isn't that the right balance we should strike in how we are analyzing that?
Well, I mean, if we value freedom and we want that for our children, yeah, we have to, we still live in a democratic country. We still have the First Amendment. We can speak.
Yeah.
If we're quiet now, we're going to forever hold our peace, because it's quickly being taken away from us.
One more question on KGB or just any kind of government guys who were supposed to stop you in your experiences and missions. Did you ever have any kind of Philippian jailer type moments with them where you had breakthroughs in conversation or seen any of them come to faith? Just curious if that ever happened.
No, not with KGB. Now, my friend Rashid, when he was being deported, he was being escorted by a car with 2 KGB agents down the Caucasus Mountains. And it was a real treacherous road, and you should be going slowly and cautiously. The KGB driver was just a crazy driver. And at one point, he took a corner so fast, he would have slid off the road, but he hit an oncoming car, stopped him from going off the side of the mountain. So Rashid, he's really bold in sharing his faith. He's from Uzbekistan. It's a really tough place to share your faith among Muslims there. So he was just gonna, these guys were taking him to the airport and gonna ship him back to Uzbekistan, and he was just gonna be quiet, just take it and not say anything. And then after that, they're going back. They're still driving this crumpled up car. As they're going back, he shares the gospel to these guys. And one guy was shook. The guy in the back with him was pretty shook up. The guy that was driving, incredibly arrogant. He goes, "Why would I need God? Look what I just lived through."
Even though his life flashed before his eyes, he was still obstinate. Wow.
Still this massive amount of pride. Yeah, look what I just lived through. Why would I need God? So that is the wrong conclusion, by the way.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Thank you, God. You must have something for me. But the guy in the back seat literally prayed out loud to receive Christ. So anyway, not many KGB stories about people coming to the Lord, but that was one.
Well, I do want to transition to talking about successes over the years. I want us to end on a string of good stories instead of, all this like self-glorification, pride, opposition from government stuff. Okay, we can transition to good things. But could you give a big picture view of the dynamic when it comes to competing religions in that mission field that you've been a part of? You mentioned, of course, Islam, and there's also the Orthodox stuff that's going on. How do you and Athletes in Action and the gospel message, how does all of that contrast with that religious culture that's there?
Right. I always had a real interest in studying the religion of the culture that I was living in. I wanted to speak specifically to, I wanted to know what they were thinking so that I could speak specifically to help them understand the gospel in the context of their culture. So yeah, we worked with Orthodox Christian, we worked with Muslim, and we spent a lot of time with Buddhism too. 5 years in Mongolia, but we spent time in Buryatia and Kalmykia. I mean, a lot of time in Kalmykia where they're Buddhist. Also, I even studied shamanism because of the the importance of shamanism in Mongolia. So I remember in Mongolia, for example, you'd have to see their gods, their Buddhist gods. I mean, every house has got a shrine in it, and the shrine will have their god, and then there'll be a Buddha, but the god is almost always Jamsran. Jamsran, he has fangs. He's got a crown of skulls. He's got a necklace of skulls. He's shown stomping. He's always in bare feet, with big feet, bare feet, stomping on people, even Buddhist lamas. So their goal isn't really to get to know God, to love God, to spend time with him, to seek wisdom that can only come from him. Their goal is to avoid him. And they do that by following all the superstitious rules. So obviously, their concept of God is very different than ours. And so, for example, at our camp, when we've got 7 days with these kids, in our evening programs, we have testimonies, and then we also each day unveil something different about God's character, and why we need God's help. So I think it's important to explain who God is before I offer, oh, hey, would you like to know him, and invite him into your life? Because their concept of God is more like Jamsran. So anyway, each religion that we worked in had, I think, had ways of helping them understand the gospel.
Okay. And what are some of the biggest, I guess, hurdles when it comes to the main people groups that you would work with? What was some of the biggest obstacles in their minds when it came to embracing what you had to say from the Bible?
In Islam, the Muslims, especially down in the Caucasus, they're raised to be very zealous, for Muhammad and the Quran. So they're at a really young age, they're taught all kinds of things about Christianity. Christianity's bad because, and there's this long list of things. And so one of the things that we did to break down those barriers were to try and show acts of love that a Muslim wouldn't necessarily demonstrate toward a Christian, So anyway, we had lots of different ideas which had an effect on a whole group of people. They understood really that it was Jesus that was motivating us to do these things. Samaritan Purse Shoebox Christmas presents, passing those out to orphanages, kids in orphanages, kids in rural schools that had, didn't have a whole lot in the little villages that they lived in. So in the end, people really did realize that the things we were doing because of the love of Jesus, really. And I think that spoke louder probably than anything else. But yeah, when I presented the gospel to a Muslim, it would be in a very specific way to help them understand why it was necessary for Jesus to die on the cross, and how he bore our sin, and that we can't get to Allah through doing good deeds. Good deeds cannot make up for our bad deeds. There's no court of law in the world where you can defend yourself, from murder or whatever. Defend yourself by saying, "Oh, I've done lots of good things in my life." You broke the law. You got to pay the consequences. And God's heaven is holy and righteous, perfect. And if we go there, we'll just mess it up, unless some way, somehow he changes us and forgives our sins. So,
amen. Well, let's talk about some of those successes when people have believed that message. You want to highlight a story or two from your many decades of going into these places and sharing that message?
Sanjik, my first year in Russia, I had a friend in Tulsa, Oklahoma, who started a humanitarian organization called Christ for Humanity, Mark Rollins. He tells me, "You're in Russia now. You got to go to Kalmykia." Kalmykia is southern Russia. It actually borders on Chechnya. It's right there next to the Caucasus Mountains.
And you said your first year in Russia, so that would be what year?
Would have been we moved there in 1991. This would have occurred in 1992.
Okay.
So he says, you got to go there because the Kalmyk people love wrestling, and they're some tribe of Mongolians. So anyway, when I went there, one of the things we did was to go into a wrestling club called Club Boomba.
Now, sorry, I'm probably just going to be interrupting you and asking questions along the way because I keep thinking of new things as you share. I'm assuming wrestling is like the thing when it comes to sports in areas like this. You're not competing against football and baseball and stuff like that. Is
right.
that a correct view?
There are, Russia is very multi-ethnic. It spans 11 time zones. The Russian Empire kept increasing in size, kept growing and encompassing all these other different people groups. So there's like 150 different languages in the former Soviet Union, probably 80 different languages in Russia itself. So yeah, the Kalmyks are a minority ethnic group, Mongolian. And in this wrestling club, we showed a bunch of American moves, American technique. And then at the end, the kids literally lined up to wrestle me. And one of the guys I wrestled that night, his name was Sanjik. And we were to meet 5 years later. 5 years later, the guy who translated for us that night in Club Boomba, he says, on your next trip to Kalmykia, I want you to meet Sanjik. He's one of the best wrestlers here. And he's become a believer. So Sanjik and I met. It turns out, here's what he said. He said, when you guys shared the gospel, I didn't understand a word you said. And it wasn't because we weren't clear. Simple gospel presentation, translated by the best translator in the country, who was a Christian. He just didn't understand the concept. The concepts of their gods, who they are, is so different than ours. It just didn't make any sense. Whatever we were saying didn't make any sense. He said, and God sent another 4 people, so 5 people total, to explain the gospel to me over a 5-year period. And on the 5th time, it was like the curtain was lifted. I all of a sudden understood. And I received it. And then, so anyway, we talked, and I realized, wow, this guy was really wanting to serve the Lord, So I invited him to study at the Bible college we had in Moscow. He came and studied. Fast forward, he is probably the most effective voice for the gospel among the Calmec people. He's a missionary to his own people. He's got several churches planted and a lot of folks that are missionaries under his discipleship out there. And it's still really hard, but at least there's a voice now out there among these people.
So you planted the seed and 4 other guys watered. 4 other guys came along and God gave the increase there in his life. That's amazing.
That's right. And that's where no one of those 5 people can say, I led this guy to the Lord. It was God, literally God, who opened his eyes.
Yeah, that's amazing. I was curious as you were mentioning that when he first became a believer and there in the 1990s, when he was living in that area, probably the only believer in his family, maybe the only believer. He was the only believer he knew, right? What would he have done for church or any kind of fellowship at that point?
Yeah, you've asked a good question. He was the first believer in his city of, the name of it is Tsakanaman. First believer, and he was ridiculed by his friends. His family disowned him. You've put our family to shame. He was looked upon like a traitor to his religion and his culture, his people, his family. It was very difficult. Yeah, there was no group of believers there that he could meet with. And so he studied at the Bible college. 2 years later, he finished Bible college and he goes back. So we're fast forwarding 2 years. 29 people are baptized in the Volga River. Their town was on the banks of the Volga River. 29 are baptized because of his witness. And years later, he told me that his dad, who had been a shaman, tried to lay hands on Sanjik and transfer the spirit that was in him into Sanjik. And he said literally his hair went on end, and he ran out of the house. He didn't want it. And this was before he was even a Christian. He just knew that is not what something inside of him was telling him. Something inside of him was telling him that it's evil. So anyway, and the church there in Tsakanaman was born right there at that time. No, it's incredible. He saw a vision when he first became a Christian, and he's in this vision. The Calmec people, they're in a long line, and they're going forward on real flat ground, and one by one they're dropping off this the edge of this cliff, which has no bottom, the bottomless pit basically. And he realizes he wanted God to have him stand in the way and point a different direction. And so and right after that we meet, and I invite him to study at the Bible college. And so anyway, I went down there lots of times to help him. One of the things that helped turn the corner was we gave out those Samaritan Purse shoebox Christmas presents to all, a lot of the little kids in this village, several of the schools. And people began to realize that, hey, Christians aren't that bad of people. In fact, they're kind of nice. And it opened them up to start listening rather than looking at him, at Sanjik, as a traitor. They started actually listening to him. They started actually coming up to him and asking questions. So,
well, I imagine that's the goal of your missionary efforts has been to see when people are converted that they turn around and go back and reach their own people. I mean, that is probably the most effective, when you are of that people and you can go to them with the gospel message. You look like them, you know their culture, they know you, and to have 29 people baptized is a testimony to that kind of impact that can have. That's amazing.
Yeah.
How often still today in areas like Mongolia or wherever you may be, do you have that same kind of dynamic where if a person becomes a believer, that person's going to be isolated because there are no other believers? Is that a pretty frequent thing still?
Oh, especially in Muslim areas. Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
And that has to be just so difficult whenever there's no church to what an embarrassment of riches we have in America, most places, right? Where it's like, well, okay, if you want to go to a church, here's a list of 40 good options near you. Whereas, in their situation, they must feel so alone.
Yeah. I forgot to mention, when I was being deported, one of the guys that worked at the airport, he was friends with us. He actually went to Bible studies, coming out of a Muslim background, but he'd always, it was kind of fun to go to our Bible studies, and it's fun to hang around the younger people that we had there. But he hadn't made any decision. When I was being escorted on the plane by the KGB, Zaur was right alongside me, identifying himself with me in front of the KGB. Okay. I was sad, right? He had the saddest look I've ever seen on a human's face. He called up my friend, the guy that had been with me at the airport. They let him go. They kept me, Ben Sprunger. He called up Ben Sprunger, met with him, and prayed to receive Christ that day. And it turns out that after my deportation and at the same time that was happening, the other guy that I worked with, we were the same age. We hatched this plan to go down there together. And we collected a team of young people. He was denied a visa, so he couldn't come back. We were both deported basically in two very different ways, but we couldn't ever go back. So more happened after we got kicked out than all the years that we were there before that.
Wow. God used that big time, huh?
He did. He really did. Yeah.
So what does that mean? That more happened after you got kicked out?
Just a much bigger response to the gospel. A lot. Zaire was one of them. Yeah, but then others followed.
Wow, that's amazing. Yeah. Before we finish, I want to mention too, you were part of a stand-up comedy bit. You've heard this, right? I'm assuming. This isn't news to you, right?
That's right. Farmer Steve.
My coach called me in for a meeting. He goes, Warren, you need more competition in the practice room. He goes, this is what we're doing this year. We're bringing in this guy named Steve. He's a local farmer. He used to wrestle back in the day. He was real good. I'm like, all right, I'll wrestle Farmer Steve. Steve shows up the first day. He's old. He's like 45, all right? When you see a guy that's 45 and you're 20, you're like, I'm not gonna wrestle that guy. I'll play checkers with him or something like that. So for the first hour of practice, Steve just sits down on the wall like an old guy. Finally, coach goes, Warren, wrestle Steve. I go, Steve, you wanna warm up? Steve goes like this, he goes, that's not a wrestling stance. I look at my buddy, I go, I don't want to hurt this old dude. And then they blew the whistle. Steve jumped about 1.5 feet in the air. He grabbed me by my chin and my head. He threw me on the mat and proceeded to beat me. Like when I say beat me, I don't mean he scored more points than me. He physically beat me. It was like he beat me over the head with meat. All right, come to find out, Steve is on the Olympic team in 1980. Nobody told me that. You guys remember what happened in 1980? We boycotted. We didn't go. And apparently, Steve was still angry about it.
I was sent a clip sometime last year of yeah, this guy doing stand-up comedy. Who do you remember this guy? Was he telling a true story? Who is this guy who used you as an illustration or one of his jokes in stand-up comedy bit?
Right. I've been as a farmer here for the 6 years I was here as a farmer in Missouri. I went to University of Central Missouri 5 years, was in some form or another an assistant coach and helped out with the team. My last year, I went to University of Missouri. I was invited to go there. There was this guy that had the potential of being an All-American. And back then, University of Missouri has a really tough team now, but back then, All-Americans were pretty few and far between. And this guy had a chance. So they wanted me to come and work out with him for his senior year, and hopefully he would All-American. So, and that was Greg Warren. So he and I went at it from my first day there, and slowly he did get better, and he did place in the Nationals. He was All-American.
Wow.
He would have won if he did what I told him to do. I told him, you go out there and win.
Oh, yeah. Oh, there you go. Yeah. Why did he disobey that simple instruction?
Simple instructions.
Well, okay. I had to bring it up just because I don't know if I've ever had a guest on the show who was featured in a stand-up comedy bit. So.
Yeah, I am the punchline now of a stand-up comedy routine. Farmer Steve.
Farmer Steve, yeah.
That's right.
Okay, well, very good. Well, thanks so much for coming on and sharing. The book is it's The Unlikely Missionary, right? Not An Unlikely Missionary? The Unlikely Missionary. Yeah, I'll have a link to it in the show notes where people can get it. Amazing story that God would use a guy like you to reach people around the world. I mean, isn't that amazing?
It is amazing. And thanks for having me on the show.